The night Marcus Webb signed the contract, the room held its breath. $33 million. That's what the number on the page said. 33 million. He read it 3 times. The pen felt heavier than it should have. The lawyer across the table smiled. The investor beside him clapped once, slow and satisfied, like a man who had seen this moment before and knew exactly what it meant. And Marcus signed. The room erupted. Champagne appeared from nowhere. Camera phones flashed. Someone slapped him on the back so hard he nearly dropped his glass. People who hadn't spoken to him in years were suddenly in his ear, laughing too loud, their hands warm on his shoulders. It was the kind of night that feels like a dream, except you're completely awake, and you can smell the cologne and the expensive wine and the carpet in that hotel ballroom, and you absolutely know, that your life has just split in 2. There is before this moment, and there is everything after. Marcus drove home alone that night. The city lights blurred past the windows. His phone kept buzzing. He turned it face down on the passenger seat. When he pulled into the driveway, the kitchen light was still on. It always was. She waited up. She had been waiting up for him for 11 years, through every pitch meeting that went nowhere, every late night at the office, every moment when the dream felt like it was slipping away. And tonight, the night it had finally arrived. He sat in that car for 4 full minutes before he walked through the door. Her name was Rachel, and she was standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of tea, still in her work clothes, her hair pulled back, her reading glasses sitting on top of her head. She looked up when he came in. She saw his face, and she smiled. That quiet, knowing smile she'd had since the first day he met her. And she said, simply, "You did it." He nodded, and for a moment, just a moment, something in him softened, but by morning, the distance had already begun. Before we get deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of my upcoming videos. Because this story, it is one you are going to want to sit with for a while. Let me take you back. Because you cannot understand what happened in that driveway, in that kitchen, in the months that followed, without understanding where Marcus Webb came from, and more importantly, without understanding where Rachel came from. Who she was before the money, before the mansion, before all of it. Marcus grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the youngest of 3 boys, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs, and a father who left when Marcus was 9. He told that story in interviews later, when the press wanted a narrative. He said it shaped his hunger. And maybe that's true. But hunger alone doesn't build anything. Hunger just keeps you up at night. Rachel Simmons grew up 2 neighborhoods over. She was the steady one, the planner, the girl who had a notebook for everything, who paid attention to fine print, who showed up early and stayed late. Her mother was a schoolteacher. Her father ran a small hardware store, until his knees gave out, and then he ran it sitting on a stool behind the counter. They were not rich, but they were reliable, consistent. They showed up, and Rachel learned that from them. She met Marcus at a community college business class when she was 22 and he was 23. He sat in the back row and talked too much. She sat 2 rows in front of him and turned around to shush him twice in one lecture. He asked for her number after class. She almost didn't give it to him, but she did. And what she saw in him, underneath all the noise and the big ideas and the restless energy that made most people exhausted, was something real. A belief, a genuine, unshakable belief that he was going to build something. She believed in that belief, and that, more than anything, is what held them together through the years that followed. Because those years were not easy. His first business was a logistics company. It failed in 18 months. He owed money to a supplier and a cousin and a college friend who had trusted him, and he paid them all back slowly, over 2 years, while Rachel worked double shifts at the hospital where she was an administrative coordinator. She never complained. Not once. Not to him, anyway. She might have cried in the car. She told me that herself, years later, but never in front of him, because she knew that if she showed him how tired she was, he might stop believing, and if he stopped believing, they would have nothing. The second business was closer. A software consulting firm, small, scrappy, mostly Marcus on his laptop at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Rachel did the books. She organized the contracts. She negotiated the early client renewals when Marcus was too proud to follow up, and when investors laughed at him. And they did laugh more than once. In that particular way that people in nice suits laugh at men in borrowed ties, she was the one who sat with him in the parking lot afterward and said quietly, "They don't see it yet. That's their problem." Then her father got sick. It wasn't sudden, it was the slow kind, the kind that takes everything you have, financially and emotionally, over the course of 2 years. Rachel flew home on weekends. She handled his insurance paperwork. She helped her mother keep the hardware store running. And when her father passed, he left her a small inheritance, $40,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was everything he had worked for his whole life. And he left it to her. She called Marcus from the parking lot of the funeral home. He answered on the second ring. She told him what her father had left her. There was a pause. And then Marcus said, "That could save the company, Rachel, if we put it in now, and we can make it through to the next funding round." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he said her name again, just to make sure she was still there. "I know," she said finally. "Is that okay?" Another pause. "Build it," she said. "That's what he would have wanted." And so she put her father's money into Marcus Webb's company, and she never mentioned it again. That was 7 years before the deal, 7 years before the $33 million, and 7 years before the night he came home from that ballroom and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes, instead of running inside to celebrate with the woman who had made all of it possible. Now, here's where I need you to pay attention, because this is where the story shifts, and it shifts slowly at first, slowly enough that if you weren't watching carefully, you might miss it. The deal changed things, not overnight, but fast enough that the change felt like a door swinging open. New offices downtown, new suits, a new car, 2 new cars, a financial advisor, a PR firm, a photographer who came and shot Marcus in the new office for a magazine profile. That called him a self-made visionary. Self-made. Rachel read that word in the magazine and set it down on the kitchen counter and walked outside. The new world Marcus was entering had a certain look. The investor dinners were at restaurants with menus that had no prices. The people around the table spoke a different language. They referenced funds and structures and terms that Rachel understood, because she had been doing the books for years, but they spoke them as if they were passwords to a room she hadn't been invited into. The women at those dinners were polished in a way that felt curated, jewelry that caught the light, outfits assembled with precision, laughter that arrived on cue. Rachel was not polished. She was real. There is a difference. And the people at those dinners knew it the moment she walked in. She wasn't ashamed of who she was. She was just aware, for the first time, that the man beside her was becoming aware of it too. She saw it in the way he adjusted his jacket when she spoke, in the split-second pause before he introduced her, in the way he laughed a little too easily at a joke someone made at one of those dinners. A joke about women who don't understand the game. It wasn't directed at her, but she was the only woman at the table who had actually played it, and he didn't say a word. She brought it up in the car on the way home. She was calm about it. She wasn't yelling. She just said, "You didn't have to laugh." He said she was being sensitive. She looked out the window and said nothing else. But that was the first crack, the first place where the cold air got in. Over the next several months, the cracks multiplied. He started traveling more. She understood that. She had always understood his work. What she didn't understand was why she was no longer invited to events she used to attend as a matter of course. Why he stopped telling her about the meetings in advance. Why, when she called him at the office, there was a woman named Bridget, young, cheerful, aggressively efficient, who always answered first and sometimes forgot to pass the message along. She didn't accuse him of anything. That wasn't Rachel's way, but she paid attention. She had always paid attention. It's how she had kept the company alive through 3 near collapses. She noticed things. She filed them away, and she waited. The conversation came on a Tuesday night in November. Marcus had come home late. He smelled like a restaurant she didn't recognize. She was in the living room with a book she hadn't been reading. He set his keys down and looked at her, and she could tell from his face that something had already been decided. He said he had been doing some thinking. He said the company was in a new phase, that he was in a new phase. He said, carefully, that he felt like they had grown in different directions. She put the book down. She looked at him, and she said, "Tell me what you actually mean." And he did. He said that at this level, at the level he was now operating at, image mattered. Connections mattered, that the world he was moving in had expectations, and he needed a partner who could move in that world with him. He said it as if he were describing a business requirement. Clinical, almost kind in its detachment. She said, "You're asking me to leave." He didn't deny it. She stood up. She went to the bedroom. She came back 40 minutes later with a bag. Not everything, just enough for a few days, because she was not the kind of woman who fell apart in a crisis. She was the kind of woman who took a breath and figured out the next step. She stood at the door with her bag over her shoulder, and she looked at him one last time. "Be careful," she said, "about what you think you own." He thought she meant the house. He would realize, much later, that she meant everything. He felt powerful that winter. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that Marcus Webb was not a villain in his own story. He was a man who had climbed so high so fast that the ground beneath him no longer felt real. He was surrounded by people who needed him to feel powerful because his power was their income. He moved through those months in a kind of euphoria that felt, to him, like clarity, like he had finally arrived at the version of himself he had always been meant to be. A woman named Danielle appeared in his life around December. She was in marketing, bright and ambitious and 29 years old. She laughed at the right moments. She asked about his work with what seemed like genuine interest. She was polished in all the ways Rachel was not. He told himself this was coincidence. It was not. Meanwhile, Rachel rented a small apartment on the east side of the city, 2 bedrooms, modest. She unpacked her things carefully, the way she did everything, methodically, without drama. She called her mother and told her what had happened. Her mother was quiet for a long time, and then said, "You always held that man together. Now let's see what he's made of on his own." Rachel didn't file for anything immediately. She didn't announce it on social media. She didn't call anyone who might feel compelled to take sides. She just began, quietly, to consult an attorney. That's when things started to get complicated, not because Rachel wanted them to, but because the truth of what had been built, and how, and by whom, was more complicated than Marcus had ever stopped to understand. The call came in February. Marcus was in a meeting with the lead investors on a new acquisition, a deal that would have doubled the company's valuation. Bridget came to the door and interrupted for the first time in her entire tenure, which meant it was serious. She handed him a note. He read it twice, and then he excused himself. The investors' legal team had been conducting standard due diligence on the company's founding capital structure. It was routine. It was supposed to be routine, but what they found was not routine at all. The original capital injection, the one that had saved the company 7 years ago, was not listed under Marcus Webb's name. It was registered under the name of Rachel Ann Simmons, because 7 years ago, when Marcus was drowning in debt and the company was 48 hours from collapse, it had been Rachel's money that saved it. And the attorney who had handled the paperwork at the time, a careful, thorough woman that Rachel had found through her own research, had structured the investment correctly, as an equity stake, registered properly, legally binding. Rachel was not just an ex-partner. She was a majority silent partner. Marcus had signed those papers. At the time, he hadn't fully understood what he was signing. He had been exhausted. He had been desperate. He had trusted her completely. And so he had signed. He sat in that conference room after the call and stared at the wall for a long time. The investors froze the transfer pending legal review. The acquisition stalled. His attorney called. Rachel's attorney called. The press hadn't caught wind of it yet. But the people who needed to know already knew. And in that world, that was enough. The mansion felt enormous that night. He walked through it slowly after everyone had gone, and the silence was different from the silence he had gotten used to. This was not peaceful silence. This was the silence of consequence. He called Danielle. She didn't answer. He called twice more. Nothing. He stood in the kitchen where Rachel used to make tea at 11 o'clock at night, and he thought about the look on her face the last time he had seen her. Not angry, not tearful, just steady. And he heard her voice again. Be careful about what you think you own. Rachel found out about the legal review the same way she found out about most things. Her attorney called her with the facts. She listened. She asked the right questions. She took notes. She was not surprised. She had always known what she held. She had never used it as leverage. Not once in 11 years. Not even at the end. She had held it the way you hold a key to a house you no longer live in, not to lock someone out, but simply because it belonged to her. She had not filed a claim against the company. She had not called the investors. She had not done a single thing to accelerate this situation. The due diligence had found it on its own, because the paperwork was correct, and had always been correct. The truth had a way of surfacing when someone finally looked. Her attorney recommended they let the process play out. Rachel agreed. She went back to work. She was consulting now for a mid-sized healthcare nonprofit, the kind of work she had always been good at. Organizing chaos, solving problems, making things run properly. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She just hadn't been doing it for herself. Can I ask you something? I want you to think about this. What does it cost a person, really cost them, to spend years building something they believe in, for someone they love, and then to be told one day that they don't belong in what they built? What does that do to a person? And what does it say about us when we look at someone like Rachel, that she didn't fall apart, that she just kept going? Is that strength? Or is that just what survival looks like when you've been practicing it your whole life? Take a moment with that. I'll be right here. He showed up at her apartment on a Thursday morning in March. No call ahead. He stood at her door in a jacket that had cost more than her monthly rent. And he looked, for the first time in months, like a man who had not slept. She opened the door and looked at him. Said nothing. Just waited. He said he needed to talk. She let him in. The apartment was warm. There were books on the shelves she'd had since college, a photo of her father on the counter, a plant in the kitchen window she had kept alive through 3 apartments. It was, he realized, the most personal space he had seen in months. Everything in his life lately had been staged. He sat down. He didn't know how to start. And she knew he didn't know, so she just waited for him to find it. He said he had been reviewing the original filings. He said he hadn't realized. And she thought he was going to make it about the paperwork, about the technicality, about the legal structure. But instead he said, "I didn't realize what you actually gave up." She looked at him. "Your father's money," he said. "You put your father's money in, when you had every reason not to." She said, quietly, "I know what I did." "I never thanked you." "No," she said, "you didn't." The silence that followed was long. Outside, a car passed on the street. The plant in the window moved slightly in a draft from the heating vent. He said he wanted to know what it would take to fix this, to make it right. And she said something he wasn't prepared for. She said, "The money was never the point, Marcus. I knew what I was walking into when I invested in you. I knew the risk. I wasn't naive." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I didn't know was that the man I believed in would grow into someone who was ashamed of where he came from, of who helped him get there." He started to say something. She shook her head gently. "I didn't want the credit," she said. "I never wanted that. I wanted you to know it, to carry it, to remember it when you were in those rooms with those people." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted to see who you would become when the pressure was off. And now I know." He left 20 minutes later. He sat in the car in her parking lot. He thought about the night he signed the contract. In that ballroom, with the champagne and the applause and the lights. He thought about sitting in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside. He thought about what those 4 minutes had cost him. The acquisition was renegotiated over the following 6 weeks. The deal got done, but smaller, controlled, humbling. The valuation was adjusted, concessions were made. His attorneys worked out an arrangement with Rachel's attorneys that honored her equity stake appropriately. Not because Marcus fought it, but because he didn't. He told his legal team to be fair. They looked at him like he'd said something strange. Danielle sent him a text in April saying she thought it was best to take some space. He didn't respond. The flashy friends, for the ones who had appeared like satellites once the money arrived, drifted back to their own orbits. The investor dinners became less frequent. The ones that remained were smaller, more serious. The magazine profile never ran a follow-up. Bridget eventually moved on to a larger firm. Marcus hired a new assistant, a methodical man in his 40s named Gerald, who reminded him slightly of Rachel. Not in look, but in approach. Quiet, careful, consistent. He was still wealthy. The company was still successful, but something had been stripped away that winter, and in its place was something harder and more honest. He started going to the office earlier. He answered his own phone more often. He called his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to properly in almost a year, and they talked for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, and every now and then, sitting at his desk late in the evening, He would think about that single sentence. Be careful about what you think you own. He would sit with it, let it work on him, because that's what true things do. They keep working on you, even when you wish they would stop. Rachel didn't rebuild her life in a dramatic way. She didn't launch a startup. She didn't go on television. She didn't need the redemption arc that the story seems to demand. She just lived, and living, truly living, after years of giving your energy to someone else's dream, turned out to be enough. She took a trip to Portugal in the spring. She had wanted to go for years, and had always found a reason not to. She went alone, and came back with photographs she didn't post anywhere, that she kept in a small album on the shelf beside her father's photo. She expanded her consulting work. A year after the separation, she was running a small team, mostly women, mostly in the nonprofit and healthcare sectors. She didn't need the equity payout to live well. She had always been careful with money, her own as well as everyone else's, but the payout helped her launch the project she had been thinking about for a long time. She called it the Simmons Foundation, named for her father. It supported women who had sacrificed their own careers, their own savings, their own time and ambition to sustain someone else's dream, and who needed help finding their way back to themselves. Business training, mentorship, seed grants for small ventures. It was quiet, methodical work. It did not make headlines, but in the second year, it helped 43 women. In the third year, over 100. She gave a talk once at a small conference in Columbus, and someone in the audience asked her if she was angry at Marcus. The room went very still, and Rachel thought about it for a genuine moment, long enough that you could tell she wasn't giving a rehearsed answer. And then she said, "No, I'm not angry at him. I'm disappointed in who he became for a while, but I also believe people can learn." She paused. "He taught me something important, too. He taught me that I had been very good at believing in other people's capacity, and that I had forgotten to apply any of that belief to myself. Here is what I think about. When I think about Marcus and Rachel, I think about how much we misunderstand success. We build these stories about self-made men and women, about individual vision and relentless drive, and we do not talk enough about the people who made those stories possible. The ones who worked double shifts, the ones who put their inheritance into someone else's company, the ones who sat in hospital parking lots and cried, and then came home and made dinner and said, "Try again." They are not invisible, but we act as if they are, and sometimes the person closest to them acts as if they are too. Not out of cruelty, out of something smaller and sadder than cruelty, out of the very human tendency to forget, when things are going well, what it felt like when they were not. Marcus was not a bad man. He was a man who got lost in a story about himself. And the tragedy, if there is one, is not what he lost financially. The tragedy is the 11 years he shared with a woman who saw him clearly and chose to stay, and the moment he looked at her and couldn't see what was there. Rachel was not a saint. She was a person who made a choice, again and again, to show up. And when the showing up stopped being something she was doing for both of them, she stopped, quietly, with dignity, and she redirected all that energy she had been giving away toward herself. I want you to ask yourself something, and I mean this sincerely. Think about the people in your life who have shown up for you, not the loud ones, necessarily, not the ones who announced their support or made a production of their loyalty. Think about the quiet ones, the ones who paid the bills while you chased the dream, the ones who said, "Try again," when the world said stop, the ones who put their father's money into your future because they believed in you that much. Do they know that you know? Have you told them? Have you shown them? Because here is the thing about loyalty. It is patient, incredibly patient, but it is not infinite. And when it runs out, it does not make noise on its way out the door. It just leaves, and you are left standing in a house you thought you owned, wondering what happened to the foundation. Marcus sold the company 4 years after the original deal. The final number was larger than 33 million, significantly larger. He was generous with his employees. He set up a scholarship at his mother's church. He sold the mansion and bought a smaller house in the same neighborhood where he had grown up. He never remarried. He dated occasionally, but the women he found himself drawn to were not the polished, curated women from the investor dinners. They were more like Rachel, steady, real, unimpressed. He heard about the Simmons Foundation through a mutual acquaintance. He looked it up. He read about its work. He sat with it for a week, and then he made an anonymous donation, a substantial one. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell Rachel. He did not do it to be forgiven. He did it because it was right. Because some debts are not legal. They are moral. And you pay them not because someone is watching, but because you finally understand what they represent. He does not know if she knows. It doesn't matter, really. That was never the point. Years after everything, Marcus was at a community event, a fundraiser, the kind of thing he attended now that he had time and resources and fewer performances to maintain. A woman came up to him. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with a particular kind of quiet confidence. She said she was one of the recipients from the Simmons Foundation. She said the foundation had helped her restart a logistics company. She had abandoned to support her husband's career. She said it had changed her life. She thanked him for what he had done. He told her he didn't know what she was talking about. She smiled. "That's okay," she said. "The right people always know." He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about Rachel in that kitchen, with her mug of tea and her reading glasses and that quiet, knowing smile. He thought about all the nights she had waited up, all the meetings she had organized, all the phone calls she had made on his behalf when his pride wouldn't let him make them himself. He thought about her father's money and the way she had simply said, "Build it," as if there had never been any question. He pulled into the driveway of his new house, the smaller one in the old neighborhood, and this time he did not sit in the car. He went inside, and for the first time in a very long time, the house felt like enough. What would you have done in Rachel's position when you've given everything, your time, your savings, your father's legacy, and the person you built it all with asks you to leave because you don't fit the new image? Would you have fought harder? Would you have left sooner? Would you have protected yourself differently? And what about Marcus? Can a person really come back from something like that? Do you believe that people change? Genuinely change? Or do you think the pressure just temporarily exposed who he always was? These are not rhetorical questions. I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me who in this story you connected with most. Tell me if this reminded you of someone you know or someone you are. And if this story stayed with you. If it made you feel something real, then subscribe. Because every single week I bring you stories like this one. Stories about people, about choices, about what we owe each other, and what we owe ourselves. Stories that are worth an hour of your time. Because some stories you carry with you long after the screen goes dark. This is one of them.